Welcome everyone to our next series of Retailers Discuss, where we at Parcel Monitor interview thought leaders, senior executives from the retail and e-commerce space. So today we're very happy to have with us Alex, former head of market expansion at Lego, and he's been there for more than 5 years. So I'm super excited for him to share his insights with us today.
Thanks for having me.
So maybe to start things off, Alex, so we'd like to ask this really fun question, and some of our interviewees find it quite tricky. So without using the words cross-border and e-commerce, could you introduce yourself briefly to our Parcel Monitor community?
So I've actually just left Lego to launch my own startup, but until very recently, as you just mentioned, I was heading up market expansion at Lego. So what this means in practice is launching and scaling Lego in markets where we are underpenetrated today. And I guess that really means quite a big focus on emerging markets.
Nice. That was a great answer. So, which also brings me to the next question. So, if you look at your profile, you have really interesting and very varied experiences, especially during your time at Lego, right? So, you've led Lego's entry and expansion strategy in markets around the world. And when we talk about around the world, it's different continents altogether. So, from Latin America, Eastern Europe, Middle East, Africa, all the way to South Asia. So maybe during your time there, so how did Lego actually identify these market opportunities and really decide to, hey, let's expand to an entirely different region?
Yeah, so I think when we look to identify new markets for geo expansion, it's probably a lot of the same factors that we look at that other international brands would consider. So broadly, we think about the size of prize and the market opportunity on the one hand, and then the ease of execution on the other. So in terms of the size of prize, of course, we want to focus on bigger markets. And in the Lego context, that typically means markets with more kids. Affordability is also a key consideration here because unfortunately Lego isn't cheap. But yeah, those are kind of very broadly some of the things that we'll look at for the overall opportunity. Then I think in terms of execution, we'll of course look at the general operating environment. So areas such as the regulations, logistics, the general ease of doing business. We'll also look at things like what distribution channels are available to us, right? So we are quite a premium brand. It's very important as a result that there exists the right quality of channels that we can work with, whether online or offline. And then if they don't exist, we of course need to look at how easy it might be to establish our own.
Nice, great to hear that. So when you actually enter a new market, right, I believe it's not going to be an easy thing, and there'll possibly be a lot of challenges you face when you're expanding a presence in an entirely different new market. So to that front, so what about kind of the key challenges that you face when you expand to a completely different market, especially when the consumer base is extremely diverse and unique?
Yeah, there are a lot of challenges that we face, to be honest. I think the first point I'll make here is that there's always a balance that you want to strike between adapting to the local environment, but then also not changing too much about your model, or maybe even not adapting too much. Because if you do that, I think you run the risk of adding a lot of complexity and even cost into your business, but B, potentially losing sight of what's universally appealing and special about your brand in the first place. So that's just the first point I want to mention, that there is that balance that you're trying to strike there. In terms of then some more specific challenges that we deal with, I think pricing comes to mind. Trying to make sure that we are reducing the differences between markets is obviously important, but can be tough because you're dealing with quite different costs of doing business in different countries and different regions. I think going back to something I mentioned before around distribution channels, adapting to different distribution channels can be tough. So for example, we're quite used to working with big modern physical retail chains or doing direct business with e-com players like Amazon in markets in the US and in Europe, which are more established markets for us. But then when you come to a lot of emerging markets, you'll have traditional trade channels offline, you'll have different e-com players and more marketplace models online. And I think that those channels aren't necessarily better or worse, but they're just different and mean that we need to rethink how we go to market. I guess finally, in a lot of this is a pretty interesting challenge that we face, is that in a lot of the markets that we try to expand into, especially emerging markets, the toy category actually doesn't exist in the way it does in markets like the US or Europe or even Singapore, right? So in a lot of markets, the idea of spending a lot of money on toys, even for occasions like birthdays or religious holidays, etc., doesn't exist to the same extent. And even the idea of encouraging kids to play can seem quite frivolous. So in these markets, our job is not necessarily just to come in and try to take share from an existing market, but in many cases to actually try to build the category in the first place, which is quite a big challenge in and of itself.
Got it. So that's actually quite interesting. So maybe could you give me an example on a particular market that had this particular challenge that you mentioned, and what was the adjustments, or how did you actually build awareness of playing or using Lego as a toy successfully?
I think there are I mean, any number of markets I could point to, but India is a big market that we've been spending a lot of time on and trying to grow our business in over the past couple of years. So it's not to say that a toy category doesn't exist in India, but for sure, it's, as I mentioned, it's different to the way it exists in the US, Europe, or even Singapore. Those occasions aren't quite the same. And then in terms of how we then go about trying to build that, I think there are two ways, and this comes to a pretty interesting thing about Lego, is that there's usually a difference between the shopper and the consumer, because the shopper is often, not always, but often an adult, and the consumer often, again, not always, but is often a kid. So we need to figure out a way to appeal to both, right? So for the shopper or the parent or the adult, it's helping them understand that play is actually quite important for a child's development. This is something that everyone at Lego really believes, and that Lego play in particular fosters skills like creativity that are critical life skills. And then for kids, it's about making Lego cool and desirable and fun. So yeah, striking that balance isn't always easy, but that's what we try to do.
Got it. Well, that is super interesting. I mean, I personally, when I was younger, I mean, we all played with Lego with the red box with the Lego cap, right? And recently, I was just surfing around Facebook. I noticed that, oh wow, Lego has ads now. So on Facebook, I actually saw ads targeting me with more like premium kind of Lego sets. I think they had one with the bonsai toy. I think that was super interesting. I even clicked in, which also nicely brings me to kind of the next question, right? So Lego has somehow managed to remain quite relevant across all age groups, I think since 1932. So of course, children is still the most important segment, but I see like the nonstop kind of innovation and creativity that comes into gaining relevance to across all age groups. So maybe as a business, so how do you think Lego has really managed to stay ahead of the curve and remain a crowd favorite for consumers over all these years?
Yeah, I think in terms of remaining a crowd favorite, probably the biggest single factor is that we are just blessed with an amazing product, right? I think the Lego system in play is a very enduring kind of system. So the system in play is what we call it at Lego. It's a very enduring one, and has quite a strong universal appeal. And then, of course, we have great designers who then come up with great iterations and interesting iterations on that concept year in year out, to help keep it relevant, and occasionally also look to explore how we can combine digital and physical play, but in a way that hopefully stays true to the core Lego values. So basically, we have, I think, a phenomenal product, which should always be the starting point, and I think is critical for that longevity. I think maybe related to that, as a business, Lego has done quite a good job of not losing sight of that great product and making sure that that stays at the core of the business. So here, if you think about it, I mean, Lego, produces video games, TV shows, movies, digital platforms, etc. Right? So there's actually a lot of contemporary forms of content that are being produced. But the way Lego kind of uses that content is to really amplify the core Lego values of learning through play and creativity, and also to bring kids back to the primarily physical play experience. So I think, experimenting in different areas, but also recognizing and keeping a focus on that core experience and that core product has been very important. Then I think finally, in terms of just how we go to market and how we reach consumers, I think we've done quite a good job of adapting well to the external landscape, right? So for example, I think we've done a good job of investing ahead of the curve when it comes to things like e-com, when it comes to our own D2C channels. And those investments have meant we were actually pretty well placed when, the pandemic hit.
Yeah, got it. Yeah, thanks for sharing. And your last sentence, when the pandemic hit, also brings us kind of nicely to the next question, a bit on a more serious note. That so in 2020, the pandemic hit, and many industries were hit, not just retail, but really across like manufacturing, logistics, etc. And I think even for Lego as a big business, they also had a bit of a setback where they had to close down multiple manufacturing sites, retail locations, I think in China and Mexico. And this, of course, would have increased the distribution costs. But despite all of that, so Lego still did pretty well. And the reports say that, Lego still saw a 21% increase in consumer sales. And I believe this was fueled by mostly the rise in e-commerce during the pandemic. So maybe Alex, so particularly for the markets that you were working on, so how did Lego adapt to these changes brought about by the pandemic, and what were kind of the successes that came out of it?
Yeah, it's certainly been an interesting year, right? That's obviously the case for everyone. But I think for Lego, it has actually been quite a good year overall. From a demand perspective, we were clear beneficiaries of the pandemic in a lot of markets. People were stuck at home, wanted things to do. In our more developed markets, had spend available that wasn't going to eating out or traveling, and could be spent on things like Lego. So that really drove a record year. So in some ways we were lucky. I don't think it's quite as easy to say that we were just lucky. I don't think that's quite the full answer, because not every toy company out there benefited in the same way that we did. And in most markets, we actually took share from the competition. So there were definitely also some things that we had done right that allowed us to benefit from this situation once it came about. And here I'll just kind of go back to the distribution point and the point that you just mentioned, where I think we were quite ahead of the curve when it came to e-com. So we were very well positioned for the change when it happened. Then you asked about the markets that I focus on particularly, and these, as I said before, are mainly emerging markets. And so I think that a lot of our success has actually been driven by more developed markets or more mature markets like the US and Europe, et cetera, this year. In a lot of the emerging markets that I cover, it hasn't necessarily been as smooth. We've still done well, but it's been a slightly rockier journey. Part of the reasons for that is, you've had maybe a greater economic impact in some markets. Meaning people are kind of less willing to make discretionary purchases. You've also had stricter lockdowns in some instances, which have impacted distribution of anything that's not essential. So it's definitely been tougher in some of the markets that I've covered, but I think we've managed to do quite well by having the adaptability to change course quite quickly. So that adaptability comes in a couple of different ways. One is by, obviously reprioritizing from offline to online channels as and when necessary. Another thing is, I think, trying as a company to take a portfolio approach to our markets, right? So simply having the patience almost to accept that in some markets at points in time, particularly over the last year, sales will be slow. And you just need to kind of accept that and not necessarily fight too much against the situation, and redirect attention to markets that can compensate, particularly in a constrained supply environment. And then what you do is wait for the macro situation to improve in the first category of markets, and start ramping up sales again when they do. So that's a dynamic that we've been seeing. It has been a little bit patchy in some of the emerging markets, but I think having that flexibility, not just within the market, but even in terms of how we manage across markets, has been quite important.
Interesting. Thanks for sharing, Alex. So it's a bit like not putting all your eggs in one basket and balancing all that risk, costs, and benefits.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, got it. Okay, so maybe going into a more kind of personal kind of questions. So, based on your profile, you were at Lego for more than 5 years. That's a long time, I would say. Yeah. So during this time, so what are one of your most kind of memorable experiences there?
Yeah, I think overall it's been quite it's a memorable place to work. I think, and I've been quite lucky in my journey at Lego. I've had a number of different roles. I've been able to move geography. So I started in London, then went to Prague, and then now been in Singapore for the past couple of years. So it's been great overall. In terms of specific experiences, I think, one of my proudest moments maybe was one of the first projects I worked on actually in the global strategy team, where we were actually tasked with recommending how we as a company to adapt our approach to the digital shifts that were taking place, ranging from our e-com approach to our digital marketing approach. And yeah, it was a super fascinating project, really interesting to take a look at how quickly the world was evolving. Yeah, hopefully laid the groundwork for Lego being able to transition so quickly to this new reality that we're all in and come out of COVID even stronger. Maybe on a less serious note, if I remember correctly, during my orientation at Lego, we had to do this like Lego building challenge, where we all had to build a duck using just a handful of bricks. And I mean, really the purpose of the session is to show that there's kind of no one way to make a Lego creation, right? No one way to build a duck in this instance. But actually the host of the session told me that my duck was one of the worst that he had ever seen. So yeah, so that was also memorable. I hope that after 5 years, my Lego building skills have improved, but I'm not sure that they have.
I would say if I were in that orientation, my duck would be the one with the worst one.
It's harder than it sounds.
Yeah, definitely. I think when I was younger, all the Lego that I kind of bought were mostly just stacked one on top of each other to build a door, or just out of the box.
Yeah.
Well, that's super interesting. I wonder if Lego still does this to new joiners these days.
I think so. I think for most new joiners, some version of that exercise, yeah.
It's cool. Okay, so Alex, so to anyone hoping to kind of expand to what you're doing, basically to expand to a completely new e-commerce market or working on cross-border e-commerce strategies, so what is the one piece of advice you would give them?
Yeah, I guess it's going to sound pretty basic, but I think really it's about understanding what's the same in a new environment and what's different, so you can then figure out what you need to change about your approach. And partly this could be about understanding the practical nuances of different e-com platforms that you may be working on. But maybe more fundamentally, I think it's about understanding the subtle differences in consumer behavior and the consumer path to purchase in different markets. And I guess to understand this, it's critical to just get whatever data you can. But I'm also a big believer that it's super important to speak to people as much as you can to really understand thought processes, the influences that they have, and the dynamics that are taking place that are sometimes harder to see with just data alone. So it's about kind of combining the two.
Thanks. Thank you for sharing. Okay, so now to the really exciting part that we really want to hear about more. So we heard that you're embarking on something really exciting next. I think you really gave a preview during the start of this session. So tell us a bit more on what we can look forward to in the very, very near future.
Yeah, so I can't share too much right now because we're still at such an early stage. What I will share is that it's in the D2C health and wellness space. So a pretty different category to Lego in many ways, but I'm hoping that some of the fundamentals I've learned at Lego around, building a great brand and creating a great customer experience, which is even more important in a category like healthcare, will prove valuable.
Cool. I would like to ask a bit more, but I understand that you can't reveal too many details. But we'll look out for your new venture then, hopefully in the coming months, I would say.
Yep, exactly.
Okay, got it. Thank you so much for joining us today, Alex. Really, really excited to have you. And to everyone, do follow us and sign up as a community member at Pulse Monitor for more data-driven insights. Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Alex.
Thanks a lot.